is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of DeFi Decoded. My name is Alex Tapscott. I am coming to you live from the South African Airways Lounge in Johannesburg, where I am waiting to board a flight to Newark, New Jersey, sunny Newark. My first stop on a final destination, of course, which will take me back to Toronto. And it's been an interesting 4 days. I've been here for a few different reasons. Number one is we've been rolling out the Blockchain Research Institute in Africa. Last year, the BRI, as we call it, signed a deal with Standard Bank, Africa's largest financial services firm, to support the development of a Web3 ecosystem and to roll out greater collaboration across the banking sector, across corporate Africa, and in government and central banks. So I've been here doing that for 3 or 4 days, and it's been a real eye-opening experience. AY, nice to see you. I hear you've been a little under the weather. So since I've got so much on my mind from this trip and so much to report, I think I'm going to do some of the heavy lifting on this call.
Good.
How are you doing? How are you feeling, man?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I did tell the viewers last week that you were going to be playing hooky this week, so happy to have you come on in the end, in between flights. And I'm just curious how South Africa. What's it like being on the ground in South Africa? We've seen a lot of stuff I've been seeing so much stuff on Twitter. I think I saw something. There's a travel advisory warning saying that the conditions in South Africa are about to resemble a civil war-like conditions, and you should stock up on food and water. What's going on in South Africa right now?
I read the same warnings before I came here, and when I arrived, I was pleasantly surprised to find that there is no revolution happening or no revolution imminent, it would seem. But it is obvious that South Africa is a country that is troubled by many problems, including government corruption, climate change, conflict, and chronic underinvestment in traditional infrastructure. Both of these things were on display in South Africa while I was here. The big story is that there's been a massive scandal involving the electrical utility. If you look at the newspaper from today, this has been every headline every day. There's a new thing, which it says, fraud at Eskom's Tutuka plant. Yesterday, it was whistleblowers pay the price. There were 5 people that blew the whistle on this corruption. And of the 5, 3 are missing and 2 are dead. So obviously, there's a lot that is not going well in this country. And while we were here, we were actually subject to frequent load sharing, where basically every few hours, the power just goes out. And it can go out for hours and hours on end. Now, this is obviously a huge disruption for business. You know, if you're a company looking to build a factory or you want to set up an office here, the fact that you may not have access to reliable electricity is going to probably give you pause before you make an investment. And this is a relatively new problem in South Africa, though it's been a problem endemic to other countries like Zimbabwe. And a lot of people here are worried about this becoming so frequent that it actually, turns people off from the country. We actually did an interview while we were there for CNBC Africa for about 15 minutes. They managed to find some time for a discussion on Web3. And the CNBC studio in Johannesburg is powered by a generator. And it's just the studio itself, like the stage and the production room. The actual offices of NBC, CNBC in Africa are all turned off. The coffee machines are all turned off. Nothing is on. So they're basically directing any energy they have to just keeping the TV show running, not even keeping the lights on, as the expression goes. So there's a lot of challenges. But despite all these challenges, I'm leaving this country actually feeling pretty hopeful for the future, and especially around technology. And I think honestly that Africa and South Africa, as one of the 3 bigger economies in the country, is going to play a leading role. So there's a number of things to point to. For starters, Africa has huge demographic tailwinds. It's the only country or only continent in the world that is young. As other continents are getting older, Africa is remaining young. And in a half a century, it's also going to be the world's most populous continent as well. And the continent has also made tremendous strides recently in health education and access to technology. Life expectancy has jumped by 25% in 30 years. In the same period, Literacy jumped by more than a third. And the technology diffusion has been even more startling. I'm sharing a room, by the way, with a few other travelers. The technology distribution has been more startling. You know, in 1993, half of the world's population had never made a phone call. And today, and I had to look this one up, but 64% of people in Sub-Saharan Africa own a smartphone. So we're in this sort of interesting situation where you've got this young, digitally native and dynamic continent where technology tools are, much more widely available than they ever have been. And I think that is, the conditions are set. Now, I'm not ready to crown Africa heir apparent to, the next era of the digital age or whatever, but it is pretty clear that, whereas all other continents are facing demographic Armageddon pretty much, collapsing populations in the next 50 years, Africa is one that is staying young and is plugged in. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
And what's the, you mentioned a little bit about the technology scene in Africa, but what specifically around sort of blockchain and crypto, the stuff that you were speaking about, and obviously with the BRI, I'm curious specifically, what's the crypto scene like in South Africa? I know there's a couple of projects I've seen in the past, often in sort of like the Bitcoin remittances. I've seen some projects, but I'm just curious. I haven't seen much about like Web3 or any of those things in just Africa overall, at least yet.
Yeah, well, in some respects, it's great, and in others, it's not, right? So it's a little bit uneven. I've been doing a lot of research on sort of the evolution of technology, which is why I've been trying to frame this trip in that context. And Silicon Valley was once called a tech Galapagos for the unique blend of factors that led to the unique species of technology entrepreneurs and companies that sort of dominated in the first era of the internet. And there was a number of different factors. It was access to capital, access to technology tools, talent, government support, in the form of R&D and technology innovations that were put into the commons for commercial use, universities and so forth. So, you look at a place like Johannesburg or South Africa, and in many respects, it's lacking a lot of those tools. There isn't a huge VC market here. There is not a massive technology sector, but there is a culture of entrepreneurship and there is a willingness to experiment. And I think what's really interesting about Web3 is that unlike previous eras, this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs anywhere in the world to tap into, I would say, like a much more global and connected industry where location matters a little bit less. Now, obviously, location still matters. You're probably better off starting a Web3 project in Brooklyn or Berlin or Silicon Valley than you are in Johannesburg. But it's no longer the massive chasm that existed previously. One executive who we spent a lot of time with while we were here told me that Africans innovate out of necessity. And more than once, South African used the word survive to describe their livelihood. We had a driver who was our limo driver, but also drives an Uber. And he says, I drive a limo, I also drive Uber, and I also help my brother with his business in order to survive. So, technology has helped to sort of flatten the world. And I think Web3 is going to flatten it further. And I think that sort of hustler mentality that exists in places like Africa is going to be a tailwind as well for people in the space. So to give you some more sort of concrete data, of the 20 largest countries in the world by crypto adoption, South Africa is in the top 20 towards the bottom. Two other African countries are higher than that, much higher, Nigeria and Kenya. I think Nigeria is number 3 overall. On the trip that we were here, we did meetings with bank executives and other sort of corporate people. We also had an event at what I can describe as sort of a WeWork type campus that brought in people from many different organizations in South Africa and from around the continent as well. And I was, pleasantly surprised by the breadth of projects. It's not just, Bitcoins and remittances, which feels to me very much like a Western design for Africa, like, oh, we're going to help you with your remittances by making you spend Bitcoin. It's actually much more nuanced than that. The general knowledge in this country around stablecoins, for example, is way higher than it is in Canada. You say the word stablecoin to any bank executive or any individual at one of these events. Now, granted, they're there because they've taken an interest in it, and they know exactly what you're talking about. They understand, the opportunities and challenge of something like that. And so I'm just very hopeful. I think that there's a lot that needs to be done, but I think most of the obstacles are just implementation challenges that need to be overcome.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, one thing that we talked about on the podcast is how kind of because there's huge problems, and in Africa, you can use technology to sort of leapfrog progress in a lot of ways. Like we saw this with kind of like how Africa used cell phones to create far more efficient sort of local agriculture markets. It created price discovery because people could just text their friend in another town to find out what prices were in another town. So that it and so it led to this kind of interesting scenario where Africa was able to sort of leapfrog ahead. It was still a lot of sort of subsistence farming, but it was aided with technology. And so it's led to sort of faster and faster growth. And I believe, I don't know the exact number, but the vast majority of sort of people in Africa have mobile phones now. The problem is they don't really have enough computing power right now, at least from what I can see, to sort of run blockchain apps locally. Blockchain apps typically are far more computationally expensive. They are they're not they're not the most lightweight type of sort of apps for the most part. And so we sort of need like an upgrade in technology infrastructure before I think crypto adoption can really take off in Africa. But what's interesting is the sort of the financial system in Africa is so inefficient in the sense that there's very high transaction fees, very high percentage of the population's unbanked. And so it's clear that crypto has a huge opportunity within the space, particularly with stable coins and things like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the word leapfrog because that was a word that came up from time to time. And it's been a theme for a while, and it is at risk of becoming a bit of a cliche. But basically, there are plenty of examples in history where we thought it was going to be very difficult for technology to gain adoption, for a population or a country to gain adoption of a new technology. So in the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, people were really worried about the digital divide, a term that was actually coined by my dad, between Western countries and those countries that were connected to the internet and those were not. And in the very early days, one of the supposed obstacles for internet connectivity was that you needed a landline in order to connect a modem. And most of the world didn't even have access to a telephone. Like in India, up to the year 2000, there were 1 billion people or more and like 30 million landlines. So how were we going to bridge the digital divide if we couldn't install more landlines? And what ended up happening, of course, is that mobile telephony became the way in which people gained access to the web. Very primitive at first, but as technology became more diffused and we went from feature phones to smartphones, all of a sudden, the number of people in the global south, as they call it, that had access to the internet really soared. So you're right that today existing financial infrastructure is out of reach to many, and in some countries, the majority of people, and many people are unemployed. But counterintuitively, paradoxically, these weaknesses actually may prove to be strengths in adopting the technology and adapting to kind of a Web3 world. Like in the same way that people in India and elsewhere and in Africa were able to leapfrog landlines, go straight to cell phones, I think that there's an opportunity to leapfrog legacy financial infrastructure as well. But there's all these other challenges. I don't want to sound like I'm looking through rose-colored glasses. It's great to have a smartphone, but if you don't have access to electricity to charge it, then how exactly are you going to, use it to perform essential things like access financial services? And they may be computationally intense and require a lot of bandwidth, and not everyone has access to the internet. Actually, I need to go back. The data that I found actually said that more people have access to a smartphone than they have access to the internet, which makes sense, or to a cell phone account, which makes sense, I guess. Like perhaps you have a smartphone and use hotspots and Wi-Fi and you scrape by, with that way in order to gain access to the internet. And I guess a smartphone can do stuff without the web, but not much, frankly. So I think that there are obviously tons and tons of challenges. One thing that kind of stood out to me is that there is a chronic underinvestment in physical infrastructure. And some of that infrastructure requires top-down government intervention, right? Like roads or railways or airports. You can't use some Web3 crowdsourced model to build those kinds of things. But in other areas, I think there is actually an opportunity to employ like the decentralized physical infrastructure model to addressing some of the problems. Projects like Helium, for example, which are trying to use, mobile hotspots as a way to like build a mesh network. And I think that's one way that you could deliver internet to far-flung places in regions in Africa. The opportunity around decentralized electricity generation, the idea that if you go in Cape Town, which is the second place that I visited, every single government built home there has a solar panel on the roof. And Cape Town is somewhat of an anomaly in Africa, I was told, in that it has generally better governance than the rest of the country. And they're actually really trying to get themselves off of the country's main electrical grid and sort of forge their own destiny. This is a country that gets tons of sunlight, and where solar panel installations are, part of the government's program. And so you can imagine sort of building like a mesh network for electricity generation as well. That would act as a complement to the existing major infrastructure that exists. None of this is going to replace it. So there was a lot of discussion around some of those ideas, but at this point, I think they're pretty experimental. To me, the big opportunity right now is you got a whole bunch of people in a continent that lack access to financial services, that are underemployed, and you've got a toolkit with Web3 that gives you lowers barriers to access financial services and also creates tools potentially for economic empowerment. One of the most insane things that I saw when I was driving through Cape Town was a guy on the side of the road who was asking for money. He was someone who was quite hard done by, and his sign said unemployed computer programmer, and then listed like all of the languages that he can write in, like C++ and Python and all that kind of stuff. And he was begging for money. So, not every person can go work for a DAO, but that guy actually could, which is kind of amazing. Like if he had access to a mobile device or, to the internet, he could actually like be a contributor to an organization that is not local that allows him to plug into, an emerging industry. Now, that's not something that can be replicated for 1 billion people, obviously, but it's certainly a start and something that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is definitely interesting. So what else? What else did you see when you were there? Did you do anything? Did you do anything fun at least? Was it just all shilling BRI or?
Does this all sound fun to you? Yeah, like we didn't have a lot of time, but while we were there, we went for a hike. There's a couple like mountains in the middle of Cape Town. There's one mountain. It's called Table Mountain, and then there's another super big hill, which I'm going to pretend is a mountain because I climbed all the way to the top of it and took lots of pictures and put them on Instagram. So everyone knows how great I am. And then we had a really good lunch of Mozambican food, which is actually kind of interesting because of its colonial history, is like a mix of it's like Portuguese food kind of infused with all these different African ingredients. It's super spicy and really delicious. And I'm Portuguese like by background. And so it was like nice to dig into that kind of food. Yeah, but other than that, it was a quick kind of trip, a short trip, but one I think that made a lasting impression on me. And, it was sort of like a contrast to the trip I took 2 weeks ago. We didn't actually do an episode, but we recorded one prior to when I went away, but I was in Dubai speaking at the World Government Forum. And to me, it's like a real study of contrast between like what's happening in Dubai and what you see in South Africa. What you see in South Africa is the definition of like a ground up movement. You've got an industry that you've got individuals and entrepreneurs who innovate out of necessity, who are trying to like create new tools to build wealth for themselves, like any entrepreneur, but also address problems in their country. And in the Gulf, you have the opposite, which is that you have a top-down approach where they're on the ground. Like there's not a real legacy or culture of startups or entrepreneurship in the Gulf, until recently, and still in many Islamic countries. If you like borrowing money is technically not halal, and if you end up going bankrupt, you can go to jail still, right? Like into debtor's prison. So that kind of legacy doesn't really lend itself to the kind of like risk-taking behavior that leads to startup formation. And so what they're doing instead is saying, okay, we're going to create some really enlightened regulations and rules around this. We're going to act as a model user. In a month, I'm actually briefing the Prime Minister's office in Dubai, virtually, about blockchain. And I said, is this something that is just for the Prime Minister's office? They say, no, the way it works basically is everyone in the government is required to do like continuing ed on key themes, and things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and Web3 and other topics are like required reading and required continuing ed for people in government. And then which like ask a bureaucrat in Ottawa what they know about any of these topics, and you'll be, pleasantly disappointed. And then the final thing is they're just putting money into it. Like Abu Dhabi announced $2 billion fund for helping Web3 startups and, increasing capital formation and investing in the region. And yet, despite all of this, Gulf countries face other headwinds. There are headwinds we've talked about for South Africa, but they face other kinds of headwinds. Like there is the issue of them not having a culture of entrepreneurship. But, despite the claims that it's progressive in some of these countries, if you're a foreigner, if you're a woman, if you're gay, if you're, someone who is at all doesn't fit the mold, like you're probably not going to feel very warmly welcome in those kinds of places, at least not to the extent that you'd want to like live there and raise a family and, start your life. So something against Dubai, every culture is different. But I do think that the playing field for where this stuff is going to emerge is totally wide open. There are going to be governments that engage in like the regulatory arbitrage and try and put money into it, like Dubai. There's going to be governments that are asleep at the wheel, but where startups are doing stuff anyway. And then there's going to be places where just because of the legacy of and the heft and the economic might, like in the States, it's just going to happen no matter what. And I think it's interesting because like, where does that leave Canada? Sometimes I go on these trips, and I wouldn't say this is true for this trip to South Africa, but for other trips where I feel like I'm like in a time machine and I'm going to these different futures. You go to Singapore where the government wants to be like a port of entry for innovators and Web3 startups, or Dubai and Abu Dhabi where they're blowing billions of dollars, or in Istanbul where I was recently, where you go to the main market in town, which was founded by Suleiman the Great, an Ottoman sultan 600 years ago. And all the shops around the main entrance are Bitcoin FX trading shops. And where in Turkey, like the amount of institutional knowledge and knowledge within the banking sector about this technology would absolutely blow you away. And then you come back to Canada and it feels like a little uneven. Now, I love Canada, as you know, but I just think that it's a wide world out there, and we could be doing a lot more, because in all other respects, it's a great place to live and do business, in my view. So we'll see. I mean, the 20th century is going to belong to whoever seizes it, and I think that's true as it relates to these new technologies too. Yeah,
it's exciting times. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, as you can tell, I'm fired up. And maybe it's because I had a glass of wine on the airplane. I'm just feeling myself.
Nice. Well, we're excited to have you back in Toronto, and we'll have a nice slate of guests coming online in the next couple of weeks.
We will. And I know that you had Jake on recently to do the SX update. And a little birdie told me that you guys got a new office. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. We're flying. We're flying right now on the SX side. And I mean, I just love bear markets because there's so much less noise in the space. And so the people who are still kind of building in crypto now are real projects that I think are going to be there for the long term. And so in a lot of ways, it's more fun to sort of work in crypto during a bear market because just bull markets are so crazy and very distracting. So.
Yeah, well, Jake told me that he's going to get me an office and it's going to have a ring light. And maybe we should turn it into a podcast studio. And you and I can finally get together. We'll get like one of those big tables and the big mics, and we'll finally get over this amateur hour, which we've been at it for like more than a year, and go pro like the rest of them. But until then, we're going to just keep flying by the seat of our pants and recording these episodes. We hope you enjoy them because we enjoy recording them. Until next time, that's it for this week's DeFi Decoded. See you later.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.